2,000 years later. 6.5 hours later. A few inches later. Day 2, Day 3, Day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow. Tomorrow for sure. Eventually. 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. 2 hours later. 8:01 p.m. The next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Later that same evening.
2,000 years later.
Several days later. 6 months later.
1 trillion years later.
2 hours later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 pair of pants later. 8 hours later.
6 hours later.
298 frozen patties later.
3 weeks later.
3 hours later. The next day, 10 seconds later, 346 minutes later, much later, 3 days later, opening night later, 3,000 years later, 3 days later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later, the following Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, much later, 7 hours later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much later, yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later,
2 hours later.
1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later, the following day, meanwhile, later, approximately 10 hours later, early the next morning, 1 shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long angry line later,
Just then.
72 hours later, 2 hours later, just then, by sheer coincidence.
Later in the void.
20 years earlier.
The end.
3 days later, 15 minutes later, thousands of tears later, several months later, 2 very boring minutes later, approximately 10 hours later, the following day, 2 weeks later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math later, 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later, 6.5 hours later, 5 hours later, 7 hours later, 8 hours later, approximately 10 hours later, 24 hours later, 3 days later, the next day, several days later, Day 2, Day 3, Day 4. 1 minute 37 seconds later, 12 seconds later, 3 weeks later, 4 to 6 weeks later, 20 minutes later, 10 seconds later, 5 minutes later, a few moments later, 1 eternity later, a few inches later, 1 hour later, late again. You get the idea. 8 semesters later.
6 months later!
Meanwhile, 1 little boost to the surface later.
A few minutes later, 1 hour later,
5 billion years later.
Later, soon after, Later, moments later, the next morning, many unbearable hours later, 82 kilometers later, a little later, 3 hours later, 1 season later, many secret parties later, moments later, 1 nap later, 1 very long digestive tract later, 6 months later, 1 pathetic sob story later, many minutes later, the next morning, 1 shift later, the next day, the next morning, later, the next the next morning, later that night, the next day, 1 weekend of pampering later, several days later. What follows is a brief construction montage. Flashback and a flashback montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowland, moments later, more moments later, later, in the void, much later, much later, 7:59 a.m. 5 minutes later,
1 hour later.
6 hours later, several song-filled hours later, the next morning, the next day, the following day, tomorrow, the very next evening, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later, 3 weeks later,
70 years later.
meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab opening night, many tic-tacs later, 1 semester later, 1 frozen wasteland later, 1 shift later, 3,000 whoop-whoos later,
80,000 impressions later.
would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. Several bad puns later. Graduation day. Epilogue. 2 seconds later.
2,000 years later.
Limited time only.
1 million zillion jillion dillion cotillion times later. 10 years later.
5,000 celebrities later.
Later that night.
1,000 decades later.
The next evening. 1 operation later.
Meanwhile, at the palace of King Poseidon, ruler of the 7 seas,